What's going on, everybody? In this video, I want to address a confusion that I've seen a lot when Futures and Foresight is introduced to newcomers. And that confusion is the idea that Futures and Foresight, in its simplest form and as a capacity to think about the future, is really something that human beings do every day. Such as, for instance, when thinking about possible future career options, or when thinking about different times in the day to do grocery shopping tomorrow. Now, I see this as a confusion because although saying that simple scenarios, such as the ones I just mentioned, are in reality a simplified form of Futures and Foresight scenarios seems desirable from an advocacy standpoint, in reality, the two things are really different, and saying that they are the same actually unnecessarily sugarcoats the practice of Futures and Foresight, fueling confusion on what it is and is not. But let me explain further by drawing from some pieces of academic research. First, Futures and Foresight deals with scenarios in the external environment in the medium and long-term future. And although there isn't really any consensus on when medium and long-term futures are, in reality, the vast majority of the Futures and Foresight literature implicitly acknowledges that medium-term future is roughly between 5 to 20 years ahead, and long-term future is roughly between 20 to 50 years ahead. Moreover, as this article written by Jim Dator and published on the Journal of Future Studies suggests, Futures and Foresight should be in the long-term future rather than in the medium-term future, because that's where the largest social, political, and economic change can happen and should be encouraged. Now, if Futures and Foresight is and should be looking at 20 to 50 years ahead, this long-term time horizon, to borrow a jargony term from Futures and Foresight, really is different from those short-term futures thought we have every day on grocery shopping and career options, right? Well, sure, but at this point you might argue that no matter whether it is short-term or long-term future, the underlying capacity to think about, plan, envision, and imagine possible futures is really the same engine, isn't it? Well, in reality, it is not. Let me explain why. There is a large amount of scientific literature in psychology that distinguishes the two modes of thinking and corroborates that thinking about the long-term future, and in particular about external scenarios in the long-term future, is much more difficult and less innate than thinking about the short-term future. For example, according to construal level theory, a very seminal theory in psychology which you will find in these two foundational articles written by Trope and Lieberman and published on Psychological Review, and many other articles, human beings tend to think about the short-term future in concrete details and about the long-term future in an abstract manner. Specifically, when we think about the short-term future, we tend to think about the processes to achieve goals. For example, what kind of ingredients we need to buy when we go grocery shopping, when and how to buy them, etc. But when we think about the long-term future, we tend to think about the outcomes of those processes. For example, enjoying a nice dinner with top-quality ingredients. Now, if we are familiar with Futures and Foresight, we will soon realize that creating scenarios, as in Futures and Foresight practice, in the long-term future is much less innate than short-term future thinking. This is because the details of the process explaining how long-term future outcomes come about is a fundamental part of scenario narratives in Futures and Foresight practice, but we are far less prone to conjure up such details when we think about the long-term future rather than when we think about the short-term future. Another key difference between the two modes of thinking comes from this article, written by Dargambault and Methy and published on the Journal of Experimental Psychology. In this article, it was found that any kind of future thought is largely guided by personal knowledge, and in particular by thinking about personal goals. In other words, we find it much easier to think about the future when that includes us in the picture rather than when it doesn't. Now, if we consider that large majority of Futures and Foresight practice consists in creating scenarios of the external environment, if we consider that we look at our role or the role of our organization in the future only after that has been done, and if we consider that how well we design our strategy in the future largely depends on how comprehensively we have created those scenarios without us in the picture, Well, then this piece of evidence further corroborates the idea that thinking about long-term future scenarios, as in futures and foresight practice, is much less innate than thinking about the short-term future. But this is actually quite intuitive. In fact, if you ever had the chance to sit in meditation and observe your flow of thoughts, what is called stream of consciousness in psychology, it will come to you as no surprise that a number of thoughts will appear in your mind effortlessly. Now, most of those thoughts will be about your past, your memories, about your present, such as sounds and smells, and about your immediate or short-term future, such as your agenda of the day or of the month. But very few of those thoughts, if not none of them, will be about the external environment in the long-term future. The last and perhaps most crucial piece of evidence on the difference between these two modes of future thinking comes from the futures and foresight literature. In this article published on Futures, Bruce Stone and his colleagues investigated individuals' imagination about the future, and they found that individuals' ability to think about the future significantly decreases, or better, to use a very appropriate term coined by the author, goes dark, just after 20 years ahead into the future. Now, this is striking because this time horizon is exactly when futures and foresight practice starts, which further corroborates that our ability to engage in long-term futures and foresight practice is actually much less innate than short-term future thinking. So, in conclusion, what do we make of all this? Well, given all this evidence, we should be clear that everyday future thinking is different from futures and foresight practice. And when we introduce futures and foresight to newcomers, we shouldn't say that in its simplest form is really a form of future thought about everyday activities in the short-term future, such as grocery shopping. Now, does that mean that not everybody can do futures and foresight? Of course not. If we find it more difficult to think about the long-term future, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't teach it or democratize it as much as we can. In fact, if anything, we should use this piece of evidence to further support our case to expand the awareness about futures and foresight practices. So I truly hope that this video helped you to think about the difference between short-term future thinking and futures and foresight practice. In this video, I looked at this issue from a purely psychological standpoint, but for sure, there might be many more angles to look at this. For example, you might argue that short-term future thinking is different from futures and foresight because the former is in our minds, while the latter should be a participatory activity done in groups. So if you can think of more angles to this issue, such as this one, please leave that in the comments down below. If you like this video, I would super appreciate to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will have many more videos about futures and foresight coming up in the future. Ciao!